"The dog doesn't trust anybody, mister. Least of all somebody who wandered in off the road," the guard said, one boot up on the bottom rail of the gate, reading the visitor policy off a schedule bolted to the guardhouse wall as though it were scripture he'd only just discovered. A dog with a flawless service record had failed every test for 14 months, and no one at Hollow Creek Regional Kennel and Working Dog Rehabilitation Center would explain why he hadn't been quietly retired the way policy said he should be. Burl Mosier stood on the gravel apron outside the fence with his hands loose at his sides and said nothing at first, because inside the cinder-block building behind the guard, muffled through 18 inches of block and rebar, a dog was refusing someone, not barking. Refusing. A long, flat silence broken by the scrape of a leash lead being dropped, then picked back up, then dropped again, and a young man's voice saying, low and defeated, "Sorrel, Sorrel, come on," to no result at all. "I used to work here," Burl said. "Sure," the guard said, not unkindly, just quickly, the way a man says a thing he's said 40 times that morning. "Lot of folks did. You got a current badge, a sponsor on the visitor log, or an appointment in the system I can walk you through. Otherwise, I got a policy says I can't let you pass this gate, and there's a dog inside that's already had a hard enough week without extra hands on the fence." "He's not having a hard week," Burl said. "He's having a hard 14 months. The guard looked at him for the first time, as though he'd said something worth hearing, then let it go, because the policy was on the wall, and Burl was not on any list attached to it. If you've ever watched someone dismiss the quiet ones in the room, you already know how this goes. Burl didn't argue. He turned instead, slow, favoring a shoulder that would not lift past his own collarbone anymore, so that turning meant swinging his whole body around like a gate on a stiff hinge, rather than pivoting at the waist the way a younger man would. He walked back toward the truck parked on the shoulder of the county road, gravel crunching under boots gone soft and pale at the toes from 30 years of the same brand, bought at the same feed store. Behind him, through the block wall, the refusal continued. No growl, no snap, just a wall of quiet that a leash and a biscuit and a young man's patience could not get past. Burl paused at the truck door and looked back once at the low tan building with its new signage, Hollow Creek Regional Kennel and Working Dog Rehabilitation Center, the letters still shiny with fresh vinyl, and did not go back to the gate. He had learned decades ago that a door closed by policy needs a different kind of key than an argument, and he did not have that key in his pocket this particular morning. He got in the truck. On the bench seat beside him, coiled with the patience of a thing that has waited a long time before, sat a hand-braided leather lead, its brass ring filed smooth long ago by a man who did not want it snagging fur, and Burl laid one hand on it the way another man might check that his wallet was still there, then started the engine and drove home to wait for a day when the gate would open on its own. Burl Mosier's mornings ran on an order that hadn't changed in 11 years, and that morning was no exception. He woke before the sun did, made one cup of coffee in a percolator older than his truck, and sat at the kitchen table with Geneva's sewing shears and a whetstone worn to a shallow dish in its center from the same 40 strokes, repeated every day on a blade that had not cut fabric since she died. He drew the shears across the stone 10 times on each side, checked the edge against his thumb pad the way she'd taught him, and set them back in the drawer where she'd kept them, blades closed, ring handles facing out for a right hand that would never again reach for them but hers. He kept the shears sharp for a dog that would never need them, because sharp was the only kindness left to give her. It hadn't started as a memorial. It had started 12 years back, when Geneva knelt over a training pup's torn nail quick in the kitchen, with those same shears warmed under a lamp, trimming the ragged edge clean, while Burl held the animal still, and marveled that a woman who'd never handled a working dog in her life had a touch steadier than his. She'd shown him the angle, the pressure, the way you don't grip the shears so much as let them ride your fingers. After she was gone, the shears sat in a drawer doing nothing, and sharpening them had become the only conversation he still knew how to have with her. He never used the word ritual for it. He would have called it upkeep, the same word he used for a fence line or a water pump, because a life spent maintaining things does not suddenly reach for finer language just because the thing being maintained is grief. His barn coat hung on the hook by the door, canvas gone the color of creek clay from 30 winters, one elbow patched with a scrap of old lead leather cut from a strap too worn to trust with a dog's weight anymore but too good to throw away. He put it on before checking the mail, out of habit more than need. The coat worn soft in exactly the places a body wears, a coat soft, the collar where his neck turned, the left cuff where he still, after all these years, reached first with the good arm. The braided lead rode in the truck cab, not the house, because some things belong closer to the road than to the kitchen table. At the kennel that same morning, Logan Beale stood behind the observation glass with a stopwatch in his hand he wasn't using, and a knot behind his sternum he couldn't name. Sorrel sat in the middle of the scoring run, haunches square, eyes forward, refusing a training dummy laced with scent markers that every other dog in the program would have alerted on inside of 90 seconds. Dr. Colton Radcliffe stood at the console tapping his laminated reference card against his palm, watching the app's readout tick through categories, engagement, latency, drive, recovery, all sliding red. 14 months, Radcliffe murmured, more to the card than to Logan. The data doesn't lie. Something in that dog's wiring just isn't there anymore. Logan didn't answer. He was watching Sorrel's ribs instead of the screen, counting the breaths, and the count wasn't the count of a dog who'd broken. It was the count of a dog holding a line on purpose, and Logan had 18 months on this job, not enough to argue with a doctorate, but enough to know the difference between quitting and waiting. The board members from the contracting firm's parent office arrived on a Thursday in slacks too clean for a working kennel, and Radcliffe met them at the door like a man greeting weather he'd personally arranged. He walked them through the scoring bay with the ease of someone who has given this exact tour many times and never tired of how well it played. He ran a live demonstration on a young shepherd named Dune, cueing the dog through a scent discrimination lane while the app on the wall-mounted monitor climbed through green benchmarks in real time, numbers updating with a clean, confident chime at each threshold. He narrated without looking at his own hands, the mark of a man who had done the motion enough times that his mouth could run ahead of his fingers. What you're seeing, Radcliffe said, is 40 years of guesswork replaced by measurement. A handler used to have to feel his way through an assessment, and feeling is inconsistent. Feeling has a bad day. Feeling gets attached. The rubric doesn't get attached. Dune alerted clean on the third pass, and the board members actually applauded. A small ripple of clapping in a room built for dogs, and Radcliffe took the moment the way a conductor takes a held note, letting it hang before he moved on. It was, by any measure, that room was equipped to make an excellent piece of work, done by a man who plainly loved the animals doing it, and for one clean minute nobody in that bay was wrong about anything. Burl was standing near the back wall when the applause died, having been led as far as the observation corridor by a sponsor badge Logan had quietly signed him in under, and he raised a hand, not high, just enough to be seen, and asked if he might have 10 minutes with the Malinois in Bay 4. Radcliffe turned, found the source of the request, and took in the canvas coat, the soft boots, the shoulder held at that particular guarded angle in about the time it takes to blink. He smiled for the board, an easy, practiced smile that already knew where the next 30 seconds were going. Folks, this is... He paused, letting the pause do work. I don't actually know your name, sir, but I appreciate the interest. We get retired fellas through here sometimes, drawn to the dogs, and I understand it. Truth is, retired men and retired dogs make a fine pair out to pasture, but pasture's not evaluation, and evaluation's what pays for the pasture. A ripple of laughter went through the board members, light and easy, the kind of laugh a room gives a man it already trusts. I'll have someone show you the visitor lot, sir. Watch your step on the gravel. Burl didn't answer the laugh with anything at all. He looked past Radcliffe to the kennel door, where the low, flat sound of Sorrel refusing another handler carried faintly under the applause, and something in his stillness made Logan, watching from the corridor, feel for the first time that the wrong man in that room was the one wearing the lab coat. 10 minutes, Burl said again, to no one in particular, and stepped back to let the tour move past him, patient as a fence post in weather. Logan caught him in the corridor after the board had gone, and what he offered wasn't much. A folding chair set against the fence outside Bay 4, a clipboard he wasn't required to hold but held anyway so it would look official to anyone who asked, and a promise that he'd square it with his shift lead as observation. Nothing more. Burl thanked him with a nod and sat, and for the better part of an hour did the one thing nobody at Hollow Creek had thought to do in 14 months of scoring. He simply watched. Sorrel lay in the far corner of the run, chin on his paws, eyes tracking every person who crossed the yard without a single twitch of his ears toward any of them. A junior handler named Priya tried a food motivation pass first, kneeling at the gate with a strip of dried liver held out flat on her palm, the way the manual specified, patient and gentle. And Sorrel's nose worked once, twice, catching the scent, and then he looked away from it entirely. A deliberate, unhurried turn of the head that was not fear and was not hunger, denied but looked, to Burl's eye, exactly like a soldier declining an order from someone outside his chain of command. He caught the scent, Burl said, quiet, mostly to himself. Turned from it on purpose. That's discipline, not damage. The second gatekeeping came from Radcliffe himself, passing through with his laminated card in hand, pausing at the fence long enough to note, for the benefit of a passing colleague, that prolonged unauthorized observation could contaminate the behavioral baseline, and that he'd appreciate it if the visitor limited his time. Logan opened his mouth to object, and Burl touched his sleeve once, lightly, a small gesture that said, "Let it be," and simply said, when Radcliffe was near enough to hear it, "Count his breaths sometime instead of his refusals. 4 to a minute at rest. That's a working count, not a broken one." Radcliffe blinked, filed it as nothing, and moved on. The third gatekeeping came an hour later, when a kennel supervisor Burl didn't recognize walked the fence line checking badges, and stopped cold at Burl's folding chair, asking with real suspicion whether he had clearance to be sitting there at all. Logan stepped in fast this time, badge out, vouching, and the supervisor moved on with a look that promised the question wasn't finished, only postponed. Burl watched him go and turned back to the run, where Sorrel had shifted his weight from haunches to a low crouch, ears now angled, not toward the fence, not toward Logan, but toward the far gate where the yard opened onto the gravel road, as though something out there mattered more than anything happening inside the wire. "He's not refusing people," Burl said, so quietly Logan had to lean in to catch it. "He's refusing everybody who isn't the one he's listening for." "Listening for what?" Logan asked. Burl didn't answer that directly. He watched the dog's ribs rise and fall, 4 to the minute, steady as a metronome nobody else in that kennel had thought to set, and said only, "A dog trained the old way doesn't forget his conditioning. He just stops answering to people who never learned the language it was written in." Then he went quiet again, and the quiet held for a long time, long enough that Logan found himself watching the dog the way Burl was watching him, counting breaths instead of failures, and feeling, for the first time in 18 months on this job, that he had been scoring the wrong thing entirely. It was Logan who pushed for the 60 seconds, cornering his shift lead with an argument built more on instinct than evidence, and it was Logan who unlatched the gate to Bay 4 himself, holding his badge up like a shield against the questions he knew were coming later. Radcliffe was there for it, arms crossed, laminated card still in hand, his tablet propped against the fence rail with the scoring app running on standby, its readout waiting on a field that had shown nothing but red for 14 months. Burl walked into the run the way he walked everywhere, favoring the shoulder, unhurried, hands open and low at his sides, palms turned slightly out. Sorrel came up off his haunches the instant the gate closed, not toward Burl, not away, just up, alert, reading him the way a dog reads weather before a storm decides which way it's going to break. Burl stopped 6 feet out and did not close the distance further. He stood, breathed, let a full 10 seconds pass with nothing happening at all, the kind of stillness that on the app's readout would register only as an absence of data, a null field with no category to hold it. Then he said one word, low, almost swallowed by his own throat, a designation built from an old trades shorthand that had not been spoken aloud on this base in over 3 decades. Hollow. It was not a command. It was not a name anyone in that kennel had ever entered into any system, because it had never belonged to any system, only to a training doctrine written by hand in the 1970s and taught mouth to mouth, handler to handler, until the men who remembered it thinned out and the word went quiet with them. Sorrel's ears snapped forward, His whole body dropped half an inch, weight resettling back onto his haunches in a posture that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. And then he crossed the 6 feet of packed dirt in 4 strides and pressed his skull, hard, into the flat of Burl's open palm, holding there, breathing against the old man's wrist in long, slow pulls that hadn't shown up on any monitor in 14 months. Nobody in the corridor made a sound. On the fence rail, Radcliffe's tablet chimed once, an alert notification with no label attached to it, a spike in a field the software had never been asked to name, because the men who built the rubric had never imagined a category for a dog answering a word instead of a command. Radcliffe stared at the screen, then at the dog, then at the screen again, his mouth already forming the shape of an explanation he did not yet have. Logan didn't move either. He watched Sorrel's tail, low and slow, sweep once through the dirt, and he understood, in the plain, unglamorous way understanding sometimes arrives, that he had spent 18 months learning to read a dog from a document written by someone who had never once learned to read the dog. "What was that?" Radcliffe said, and it wasn't quite a question, more a man talking himself back towards solid ground. Burl kept his hand where it was, let Sorrel lean the full weight of his skull into it, and said only, "His old call sign, from before your records start." He did not look up at Radcliffe when he said it. He looked at the dog, and the dog looked back at him with the plain, unhidden trust of an animal that has just been handed back something it had been guarding alone for 3 years. And the central question of that whole 14 months, why this dog? Why now? Why had nobody simply let him go, sat in the room, still unanswered, bigger now than it had been 60 seconds before? The security officer who arrived at the gate 11 minutes later was polite about it, which somehow made it worse. He held Burl's visitor badge up to the light like a man checking a bill for a watermark, and explained, with the flat courtesy of someone reading from a script he didn't write, that the badge Logan had issued was a corridor observation pass, not a handling authorization, and that Burl's presence inside the run constituted a policy violation regardless of outcome. Burl didn't argue. He asked only for 1 more minute with the dog, and was told, not unkindly, that the minute wasn't his to take. He looked back once through the chain link as they walked him toward the lot, and Sorrel was standing at the gate of the run with his head low and his eyes fixed on the departing shape of the man who'd just given him back his own name and made no sound at all, which was somehow louder than barking would have been. Burl lifted 2 fingers off his thigh, barely a gesture, and got back in his truck for the 2nd time in a week with the braided lead still coiled untouched on the bench seat beside him, because there hadn't been time to use it for anything but proving a point. Logan caught it worse than a reprimand. His shift lead pulled him off bay 4 assignments for the rest of the week and told him, in the tone of a man protecting someone he liked, to let the incident die quietly before it became a line item in somebody's file. Logan said yes and did the opposite. He spent that night and the next 2 after it in the records room nobody used anymore, a narrow closet of filing cabinets kept mostly for insurance purposes, cross-referencing the origin codes stamped on Radcliffe's baseline dataset against the kennel's own intake logs going back to when the scoring contract began. What he found took him 4 passes to trust. The baseline set Radcliffe's rubric had been calibrated against, the 14-month-old foundation, every single score in that kennel rested on, had been assembled from records that were supposed to represent working military and police dogs across 3 decades of service. But a batch of origin kennel codes had been misfiled at ingestion, swapped with codes from an entirely different population, a shelter intake dataset never meant to model working dogs at all. Sorrel's own service history, the actual 8 years of documented conditioning and deployment behind him, wasn't even in the set the rubric measured him against. He'd been scored for 14 months, as though he were an animal with no training history whatsoever, failing to meet a bar that had never been built to include a dog like him in the first place. Logan sat with that for a long moment under the buzzing closet light, and then he found, tucked behind a decade of unrelated correspondence, a single memo dated 2003, laying out the original data sourcing decision in flat bureaucratic language, describing a corrupted archive and a deadline that couldn't slip, and a signature at the bottom that made his stomach drop clean through the floor. Colonel Emma Trelawney, Base Operations. He was still staring at it when his phone buzzed with a base-wide notice. The contractors board had moved its renewal vote up. 7 days, not 9, the message read, citing scheduling concerns. and Logan understood without being told that somebody upstairs had gotten nervous about exactly the kind of question he was now holding in his hands. Radcliffe did not want to see the memo. Logan laid it on the console beside the tablet anyway, next to the laminated reference card, and for a long moment, Radcliffe simply looked at his own rubric's foundation document as though it belonged to a stranger. "This isn't," he started, and stopped, because the origin codes were right there in his own firm's handwriting, stamped and dated, plain as a fence line. "The data doesn't lie," he said again, quieter this time, less a boast than a man checking whether the sentence still held any weight in his own mouth. "I built the scoring logic clean. I didn't touch the sourcing. That was before my time at the firm." "I know," Logan said. "That's what I'm telling you. It was before your time. It was 2003. He tapped the signature line. "Whoever cleared this, cleared it fast and cleared it without reading past the summary page. You inherited a foundation nobody ever checked twice." Radcliffe read it a second time, then a third, his thumb moving unconsciously along the edge of the laminated card, as though it might still have an answer his rubric hadn't offered yet. "If this is right," he said slowly, "then every score this program has generated for 14 months has been measuring dogs against a population that was never—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The number sat in the room with them. Every animal scored, every recommendation filed, every dog like Sorrel judged failing against a bar built from the wrong species of history. He made the call himself, which cost him something Logan could see even if Radcliffe never said it aloud. Within the hour, a name neither of them had summoned arrived at the kennel gate in a plain government sedan, and the guard who'd once recited visitor policy at Burl Mosier came to sharp attention without being asked twice, because Colonel Marissa Trelawney did not require an introduction on this base. She was 58, silver-cropped, moving with the economical stride of someone who had walked into worse rooms than this one and intended to walk out of this one having fixed something. She did not come as a rescuer. Logan understood that within the first 10 seconds of watching her read the 2003 memo Radcliffe held out to her, her own signature staring back up at her from a page she had clearly not thought about in 20 years. She read it twice, standing very straight, and then read it a third time, sitting down in the folding chair someone pulled up without her asking, because standing had, for that particular minute, stopped being available to her. "I signed this," she said, mostly to herself, "on the strength of a summary paragraph because I trusted the man who wrote it, and I had 4 other memos on my desk that same morning." She looked up, not at Radcliffe, but out through the fence toward Bay 4, where a dog she had once watched pass a training course 30 years before now lay curled with his chin on his paws, waiting for a man who wasn't allowed back through the gate. "And it's been sitting in a drawer costing dogs their futures for 2 decades, and I never once pulled it to check." She asked Logan to bring Burl back to the base before the vote, and this time it was Colonel Trelawney herself who stood at the gate to receive him, which meant the guard who had once quoted policy at Burl now stood a half step behind her, with his hands folded and his eyes forward, saying nothing at all. She didn't offer her hand first. She didn't say anything about honor. She stood in front of Burl Mosier, 74 years old in a canvas coat gone the color of creek clay, and recited, without a single pause or correction, the entire 7-step scent and trust conditioning sequence he had written by hand in 1978, word for word, gesture for gesture, down to the exact interval of stillness required between the second and third approach. A procedure that had been taught at this base for over 40 years under a renamed heading that credited no one, and that she had learned as a young lieutenant from an instructor who had learned it from Burl himself. "They call it the Adaptive Trust Protocol now," she said when she'd finished. "I taught it to 11 classes of handlers over 6 years and never once heard your name attached to it until 3 days ago." She held his gaze the way a woman holds something heavy she is finally allowed to set down. "I owed you that recitation before I owed you anything else. I wanted you to hear it said correctly once, by someone who never should have needed to be reminded whose it was." Burl didn't reach for the moment the way another man might have. He looked past her, toward the kennel building, toward the wall of block and rebar behind which a dog was, for once, not refusing anyone. "I don't need it said," he told her, and his voice carried the particular quiet of a man who has spent decades meaning exactly what he says and no more. I need Sorrel's file corrected, and whatever other dogs got measured against numbers that were never built to hold them. That's the whole of it. Trelawney studied him for a long moment, and something in her posture, Logan noticed, eased slightly, as though she had expected to owe a debt that demanded more of her than this, and found instead a debt asking only for the plainest kind of repair. "That's all," she said, not quite a question. "That's all," Burl said. "A man doesn't need his name on a procedure. A dog needs his record to tell the truth about him." He paused, and for one of the only times in the whole affair, said something closer to explanation than instruction. "I wrote that protocol because a boy I served with lost his partner to a bad call made by somebody reading a chart instead of a dog. I didn't want that mistake to have a second life. Seems it found one anyway, just wearing a different coat." Trelawney nodded slowly, and whatever she had planned to offer him next, a commendation, a formal apology, a line in a base newsletter, she set it down unspoken, understanding that it wasn't the currency this particular man had ever traded in. Instead, she turned to Radcliffe, who stood a few paces off with the laminated card still in his hand, useless now, and said only, "Fix the packet. Every dog. Before the vote, not after." Radcliffe nodded, and for the first time since Logan had met him, he didn't reach for the tablet at all. The correction went in 4 days ahead of the vote, filed under Radcliffe's own name with a cover note that didn't hedge or soften a single line of what had gone wrong, and the board, weighing a corrected packet instead of the flawed one, renewed the contract on the condition that every score generated in the last 14 months be rerun against a properly sourced baseline. Sorrel's file, along with 31 others, came back clean, each one a small, quiet correction nobody outside that base would ever read about, which was, Burl told Logan once, about the right amount of attention for a job like that to get. Weeks pass the way they do when a thing has finally been set right and doesn't need watching anymore. Burl came back to Hollow Creek by invitation this time, his name entered properly into a visitor log that no longer required a policy recitation to explain his presence, and most evenings found him in the kennel yard as the light went long and gold across the fence line, working with a young dog named Rye who had washed out of 2 other programs before anyone thought to ask an old handler what the numbers weren't showing. He knelt in the dirt with the patience of a man who had never once been in a hurry about anything that mattered, hands moving through a braid he had made 1,000 times before. Over, under, tension checked with 2 fingers, the same rhythm his own hands had learned 50 years earlier from a sergeant long dead, passed now to a length of fresh leather, meant for a dog who wasn't his and never would be, which was exactly the point of making it. Logan crouched across from him, watching the sequence of Burl's fingers the way a much younger man watches something he intends to still be doing when he's old, and Burl narrated it plain, no flourish, the 7 steps of a protocol with somebody's actual name back on it now, spoken once, correctly, the way Trelawney had spoken it to him. Sorrel lay stretched along the fence line in the last of the sun, his skull resting heavy and unbothered on the toe of Burl's boot, breathing slow and even, 4 to the minute, exactly as he had all along. On the top rail above them, coiled and at rest, the old braided lead sat where Burl had set it down that morning, its brass ring worn smooth by hands that had filed it that way on purpose 36 years before, so it would never catch on anything alive. Some records get corrected. The dogs who waited for that to happen are the ones worth remembering.